Toolboxers. Welcome to episode 272 of the Immigration Lawyers Toolbox podcast. We have another fun and interesting one coming for you today. Another former consular officer who now does special service, and not a lawyer, but he helps immigrants and lawyers as well, a lot of agencies, to get people bypassing the red tape that's involved with the immigrants here, especially during when COVID was happening. Really interesting stuff. Check it out. It's going to be a lot of fun. Then we have another episode coming up quickly after this one, talking about how 2023 is going to look like financially and how to prepare. There's these bad omens of what's happening in the economy and how to prepare for that with a really experienced immigration attorney, John Grode, who's been doing it for a while. He's got a real big firm and knows what he's talking about. So that should be a lot of fun. If you haven't already, check out the Immigration Lawyers Toolbox magazine. The new issue is out, number 6. A lot of good stuff in there. A lot of different areas. Red Interpol notices. A former consular officer talks about fraud findings and how to avoid those at the embassy, especially for things like K-1 and marriage cases. So it's a really interesting thing. Just go to immigrationlawyerstoolbox.com and click on the magazine part, and you'll get it. I want to thank our sponsor, DocuWise, who's always been so helpful with support of the magazine and the podcast. Get 10% off your annual plan by go to immigration. That's how you go. You go to DocuWise.com/immigration-lawyers-podcast. Use the code Immigration Lawyers Podcast. Get 10% off. We have another video just published that goes into a lot of the new updates that they're happening. They're doing the DS-260. They have e-signatures. A lot of cool stuff that's unexpected for a immigration form company to have, and it's really competitive. So definitely check it out. If you haven't already, wherever you're watching this, like and subscribe. Leave a good review. It helps get the word out. More attention means I can do this stuff more often, which I love doing. It gives me more energy to do it too. So definitely wanted to talk about that. And finally, the conference is coming up very soon. O1, learn how to do them, expand your practice, teach them to your associates. If you don't have time, they can come and do it too. We only have around 5 spots left. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner, intense networking, intense session, small, very small group. There's nothing out there like this. And so we're going to really change the game with these conferences. Come to the one in Santa Monica, California, February 24th. It's a Friday. Have a good time and get out of the East Coast winter and enjoy this weekend here in sunny Los Angeles. It'll blow your mind how much fun it'll be. So just go to immigrationlawyerstoolbox.com or iltbox.com. Check on the postgraduate link because this is a series of postgraduate studies we're starting. And check it out and sign up or email me if you have more questions and get on it before it runs out. We're going to be blasting this on a lot of local bar associations soon, and that's going to fill up really quick. So on the national stage, when people listen to this podcast, if you're not in Los Angeles and not part of these groups, you're not going to hear about it. So you're early to it. Get on top of it before it runs out. Having said that, anything we talk about is not intended for individual legal guidance. Consult with an attorney. Having said that, let's get the show started. So I'm here with Travis Murphy. Travis is kind of like an immigration lawyer, but not really. He's been a consular officer, so that does half the job right there. And he's been deep working with visas for many years now. So it's just an interesting background that he has working with the NBA, his company, Jetr Global, all this kind of stuff. So I thought it was important, and plus the State Department. So I thought it was very important to bring him on the show for immigration lawyers and know about him, his background, the stuff he does, because it comes in really handy. We call this Immigration Lawyers Toolbox. You're a great tool in the system because if someone has an issue that's within your purview, you're a great resource to go, especially when it comes to sports-related stuff, but it kind of go other stuff. So with that long introduction, Travis, thanks for coming on the show. Could you break down where you grew up and how you got involved in state, and we'll take it from there?
Yeah, great, John. Thanks so much for having me on the program. Happy to do this and talk a little bit today about the work of Jetr Global and kind of what we're doing in the sports and global mobility space. You're absolutely right. I'm not an attorney, so I feel like I need to say that to your listeners who are accustomed to hearing attorneys be on this podcast. But I would say, legally adjacent from the perspective of kind of working with sports immigration attorneys, primarily those working in sports, and then athletes, leagues, individuals around the world to try and expedite visa processes, to try to cut through red tape, specifically working in that vein of sports and diplomacy. And so we can talk more about that and kind of flesh that out a little bit, what that means. But to your question, so I got my career in politics. I started working on Capitol Hill early in my career. So came to Washington, D.C. from my home state of Kansas, worked for my home state congressman, eventually became his chief of staff.
Wow.
And so worked on policy issues for a number of years.
Right there. I've never talked to the staff before. is it true that chief of staff is really running the office or not?
Well, I mean, every office is different. There's 535 members of the House and Senate, and so each office is unique and different. But even from early days of my career, I was overseeing the DC office, which was the policy arm, and then the district offices, which had constituent services representative. So any attorney who's reached out to a member of Congress to try and facilitate a congressman or a senator's intervention on a particular immigration case knows exactly how they work.
Yeah.
So I was overseeing that. So, really got involved in kind of understanding the process, how it works, how it doesn't work from an early age and an early point in my career.
I studied political science, and my original track in life was going to DC and work there. And then I decided against that. I went to law and somehow found myself in immigration. But so I have questions I'm not sure all listeners are interested to, but I kind of want to dig into that. I didn't realize you're chief of staff. So what years were you chief of staff? What years were you working in Congress?
So I was there from 2000 until 2006, and then that was in Washington. And then I left for a few years to go back to grad school. And then I came back to Kansas and oversaw. So I was his state director and helping lead up to his run for the Senate in 2010. But at that point in time, I was overseeing all the individual constituent services representatives in the district. So was very much involved in the day-to-day. And some of your listeners may remember back in 2007 or 8, actually, it was right before the crash. And when they started requiring passports for Mexico and Canada, but provided no staffing or support around actually producing all those new passports for vacations that had already been planned. So just, travelers around the country were reaching out to their members of Congress, and we were just slammed with requests, and then worked with the passport agencies to try and facilitate and get everybody printed and prioritized. But, like I said, so have been doing this now for going on 20 years.
It was a pivotal time. Is it 2000, 2006? So that's 9/11, creation of Iraq War, and the creation of the Department of Homeland Security as it is. What committees was the congressperson you worked with? What committees was he on?
So much of the focus was on veterans issues because it was a district with a lot of veterans, and then as you correctly noted, that time period was amidst the early stages of the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq. So then you had military members coming back home. Transportation's a big issue in a state that's so reliant upon agriculture. And then he worked a lot on agriculture issues as well. And then immigration became more of an issue over the time that I was there, because that was becoming more of like a Republican versus Democrat, that was becoming more of a hot button issue. But you're absolutely right. Was there through the formation of the Department of Homeland Security. The member of Congress for which I worked actually voted against the formation of that entity, with the justification that he didn't come to Washington to invent more government. And I think the jury's still out as to whether or not it works. I suppose it depends on who you ask. But taking all these different agencies that were working, some independently, some quasi-independently, and kind of scooping them all up and saying, okay, you're all a part of the same department now, I think was a heavy lift to try and accomplish.
It's I agree with them, and I'm very happy they work for someone like that, because it's like it sounds like a smart idea. Well, let's centralize it and stuff like that, but it's too simple to just put all this together. There was a chart for Homeland Security that I published on the website for Toolbox, and it showed how the structure is set up, and it's just impossible to operate a machinery like this. Department of Homeland Security, especially USCIS, has the highest dissatisfaction rating amongst all the employees of all the federal government. So, I mean, it's just, he was right. They could have just fixed some stuff up. The way it's made right now doesn't make any sense. And then how was the voting for the Iraq War? Everyone was scared post 9/11. Almost everybody voted for the war. What was the mood and during the time in making that decision? Obviously there was a lot of scare, and the government, the executive branch, really put a lot of scare in a lot of people about Iraq. But what do you recall was going on, the mood and the thought process at the time?
Well, you have to put yourself in that mindset of 20 years ago, right? Post 9/11, 21 years ago. The invasion of Afghanistan was, that was obvious. There needed to be retribution for what took place on 9/11. So I don't think anybody questioned that. Obviously, the Iraq War was much more controversial, and we look back on that now with the hindsight of knowing that really a lot of the justification that was shared at that time was either inaccurate at the very least, or wholly falsified and fabricated at worst. And so, at the time, we were being told by experts in the field, by high-ranking government officials that there were weapons of mass destruction, that this posed an imminent threat. And it didn't quite add up, but at the same time, it's like, well, I mean, we're being told by the experts, we're being briefed both unclassified and classified briefings that are showing specific instances of the creation of weapons that could potentially harm Americans, or at the very least our allies. And so, decisions were made based on information that wasn't accurate.
So sorry to take on these tangents, these controversial subjects that you
fair enough.
It's interesting having an eye to see what was going on at the time there, but it was a scary time. I mean, there's a whole generation of Americans now that have no idea. I mean, we're 2021. The 21-year-olds voting today has no idea what pre-9/11 life was like and pre-Iraq War life was like. It's such a before and after in American history. It's a lot of studies going to come out in the future of how this all. I mean, it already has, like with what the document information they get and all that. But okay, so you're already working with the government apparatus. You're familiar with it. What did you study in grad school, and what made you do the switch to become a foreign service officer?
Yeah, so I went back to school and got a master's in public administration. I thought maybe at some point I might myself run for office, or at the very least, be involved in government at a local level. But ultimately, I was back working in the district for a couple of years. 2010 was not a great year in terms of politics. It just was, that was kind of the rise of the Tea Party was that year. And so like the tenor was already starting to change. And I had been working for a member of Congress who was very focused on constituent services. And I really wanted to broaden my perspective at that point in my career. And so was looking at various options, seriously explored the Peace Corps for some time, and then ultimately took the Foreign Service exam around the same time. And so ended up getting accepted into the Foreign Service in 2009, right at the beginning of the Obama administration, when there was an increase in funding and kind of an opening up of the Foreign Service ranks to bring in more.
Consular, I was asking a lot. How long did it take you from the time you gave the test they actually called you up? Because I heard there's some delays sometimes. It could be like a year or two before they call you, or even more. How long did that go for you?
So I would have taken the written exam in March, the oral exam in December, and I didn't join until June of the following year.
Relatively quick for that process.
It can stretch for years. It's definitely something I advise young people considering it. There's no harm in taking the test, but just keep it on the back burner. Don't quit your day job.
Great. So you took the foreign exam, you got they accepted you, and then how did the assignments go? What happened after that?
Yeah, so then you come in and you do an initial training, which is called A100. So that's kind of your orientation and introduction to the Foreign Service. You come in a class, and so think of like cadets, newly christened Foreign Service officers. And so there's a list of job postings around the world, predominantly consular-related positions, especially for entry-level officers, and a list of individuals. You choose preferences, but they may not match. They say frequently in the Foreign Service that you serve at the will and the desire of the department. So where it makes sense to send you, they are ultimately going to send you. So my first post was to Quito, Ecuador, which fortunate for me was my number one choice. I wanted a Spanish-speaking country, and wanted to kind of keep from a time zone perspective roughly in the same part of the world.
Were you married at the time, or married now, or anything like that? Kids?
Married at the time, yeah. To an attorney. So my wife at the time was in law school, so we were going through it.
So I mean, did you leave and she stayed in law school, or how did that work out?
Yeah. So she was in so I finished the oral exam and found out I got into the Foreign Service when she was finishing her in the midst of exams for her 1L first semester.
1L year.
So we were really, so those who have been through that process know what a stressful time that is. And then we determined she was in Chicago at Northwestern, and so we determined like, okay, so our lives are going in two different directions here, but we'll make it work, and ultimately did.
Consular officers, it gets really frustrating as immigration lawyers sometimes dealing with consular, but they have to undergo a lot of hardship in their life to make this happen, because you're at the whim of the departments, and you get sent to, you might get sent in the middle of a war zone for all you know, or the expectation to have you all over the place. So it is a sacrifice. It's a hard thing to do. So you went to Ecuador. What cone were you?
I was public diplomacy cone, so more kind of outreach, cultural exchanges, and that's where really the root of sports diplomacy started. Was kind of working in that space that would bring people together from foreign audiences together with American people. But my first tour was fully consular.
And what kind of consular issues did you see in Ecuador pop up a lot?
So I worked on the line. So I was an NIV officer, so adjudicated tens of thousands of NIV interviews in Ecuador. There were a lot of Colombian, Venezuelan refugees at the time, so it wasn't just Ecuadorians, but you definitely saw a high number of third country nationals as well come through. I also worked on American citizen services. So foreign service is essentially broken into 5 expertise areas: public diplomacy, which is kind of outreach and connecting people. There's consular, which your listeners will probably be most familiar with. There's economic, which would focus on the business issues and improving relations between our two countries and the host country. Politics, which is more fostering the growth of democracy, and then management, which is actually the logistics of managing an embassy and all of the shipping around the world. But it really was, the thing that was shocking to me, John, was just how quickly I went from finishing my Spanish exam, getting my 3-3, what they say, you're proficient in Spanish. And then I did consular training, which was 10 weeks, if I remember correctly, but that covered all of American citizen services. So everything from passports to jail visits to death notifications to families if you have an American citizen who dies in a country, all of NIV, all of IV, everything with green cards, all of the interaction between the State Department, USCIS, DHS, which was still at that point fairly new and still kind of working out some of the kinks, and some would argue even today. Yeah. Customs and Border Patrol, and kind of how all those entities fit together. So it's not enough time to really fully comprehend. And so much of the job is just getting there and learning as you go.
Yeah, 13 years into it, I have a show where I talk about it. I'm still trying to figure it out. So 10 weeks, it's never ending. So again, were there any particular issues for Ecuadorians? You got third country nationals to come. Were there like gang member issues? I don't do Ecuadorian cases. I don't mean to discriminate, but you see that when it comes to like Honduras, Nicaragua. Did you have those? I don't know, but Ecuador doesn't really have those kind of issues, or did that kind of stuff pop up with tattoos or anything like that?
No, that wasn't really an issue in Ecuador. It's a predominantly indigenous population. And so very entrepreneurial culturally. And so there's a sizable, and I mean, obviously for most countries around the world, there's a sizable population in the greater New York City area, but Ecuadorians in particular, some estimates have that because Secretary Clinton visited Ecuador and said, I used to represent the largest city in Ecuador because there's more more Ecuadorians in New York than in any one city in Ecuador. There's just such an out-migration. And so from that perspective, refusals were somewhat high. It was a lot of tourist visas and then a lot of immigrant visa cases, which were predominantly adjudicated in Guayaquil. There's 2 posts in Ecuador.
Oh, interesting.
And so a lot of the immigrant visa cases went down there, but you had a lot of dual nationals, and then you had parents who migrated to the States, some overstayed visas, had children, those were American citizens. And so there were just a lot of kind of thorny immigration issues to kind of sort out with a population that was so mobile and so accustomed to moving back and forth to the States.
How long were you there?
I was there for a little over 2 years.
And then what was the next post after that?
I also, while I was in Ecuador, I did an extended, what we call TDY, so a temporary duty assignment to Suriname, and I was the consular chief in Suriname. And that was also really interesting. South American country, but the national language is Dutch. I didn't speak any Dutch, but they also speak English and then work through a translator when needed. It also oversees all of Suriname, the capital city, Paramaribo, and then French Guiana is the next country over. And so French citizens would come over for immigrant visa issues in Paramaribo. So it was a fascinating city and a fascinating environment to work. And they had a stack of immigrant visa cases because they'd had turnover and then didn't have anybody there. And so we really worked to start chopping through those and reduce their overall wait times for interviews for immigrant visa cases. And it's interesting now because the wait times then in 2011 were just, it was months behind, which was unheard of. We had to reduce that. And now, here we are in 2022, and it's like, oh, if I only had a couple months, that'd be great.
Cool. So that you learn a lot from the process of heading up a busy embassy like that, especially when you have third-party nationals come in, so much documentation that's different and stuff like that to learn. And then what happened after? What was the next step after that?
So then my next overseas tour was in Cote d'Ivoire in West Africa. There I was a spokesperson for the embassy, but still with my consular background, worked closely with consular. And then that was an opportunity to stretch my legs in French a bit and, do a fair amount of radio and newspaper and television interviews in my choppy French. So, but, did our best to represent the United States in a country that was coming in kind of a post-crisis mode, coming out of a civil war that had really drug on for the better part of a decade. So really a fascinating time to be there and to see kind of U.S. development aid and how that can be used effective, but also how that might be better directed. And so just being there during a very dynamic time. And then my last tour was coming back to the States and working in an office of sports diplomacy. So in the Bureau of Education and Cultural Affairs, there's an office that facilitates exchanges. So essentially having professional athletes and coaches go overseas and do sports programming with embassies to reach youth audiences. Mm-hmm. And it was through that I got to know folks at the NBA who wanted to bring somebody on with State Department experience, and I made that transition into pro sports.
Very cool. So that was the last post you had with the Department of State?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And you made a transition to the NBA, which you're
correct.
Working with. What is the association with the NBA? How does that look like? What is your job there?
Yeah, so I went to the NBA in 2016 at a time when the number of international players was really, moving upward. And since 2019, every MVP of the league has been internationally born. 4 years in a row, that's been the case. And so there was the launch of the NBA Academy program, which is setting up full-time academic and athletic institutions around the world. So they wanted somebody to help oversee the immigration in and out of Australia, Senegal, India, China, and then Mexico. And then also working with all the NBA players on their visa issues. So I was able to take the contacts I had with the Department of State and then grow that exponentially by working with NBA players and working with diplomats in different countries just to make sure that players were taken care of. Mm-hmm. And so I did that up into and through the pandemic. And during the pandemic, increasingly, I found that I was actually somewhat uniquely positioned at this intersection of sports, diplomacy, immigration, government affairs. And so realized that as I was getting more and more questions from other leagues about how to navigate processes, that there might be an opportunity to do this on a more professional, full-time basis. And so to your question, earlier this year, I spun off that work into my own consulting firm, Jetr Global Partners, which allows me to work with beyond just the NBA, although they remain a client. It allows me to work across sports to help facilitate, really to help strengthen relationships with the U.S. government. Because when I look back to when I started in the Foreign Service in 2009 to where we are today, I think some of those fundamental tools, like you talk about a toolkit, I think some of those tools of diplomacy, like those soft power tools like sports diplomacy, are not utilized as much as they used to. Yeah. And so I'm trying to remind how important these tools are, perhaps more than ever, given the current political environment, given the view of the United States and countries abroad. There's an opportunity, I think, to really use sports as a space to bring people together, and immigration plays a fundamental part of that.
Yeah, Quito, Jetr is Jetr. Is there any particular reason named it that, or is just global migration? Is that what was the reasoning or thought behind the name?
We brainstormed some names, we workshopped some ideas. I like the idea of a jet. The jet kind of implies the movement, the flying. You got your visa, you're on your way. And then Jetr, also jeter in French, going back to my time in West Africa, means to launch or to throw. And then just coincidentally, someone reached out to me recently because their son was named Jetr, Jetr, and she found out about the company and said, my son is named Jetr because it's Sanskrit for victorious. Oh, wow. And I had no idea that was the case, but it seems kismet. Yeah, very happy accident.
That could be a brand name for clothing now. You can just put that out there too.
I know.
I wanted to jump in for a quick second and talk about one of our wonderful new sponsors, immigrationevaluationdirectory.com. Did you know research reports psychological evaluations can increase an asylum applicant's chance of approval by 78%? Psychological evaluations are hugely beneficial in hardship, cancellation, asylum, and other types of immigration cases, whether with USCIS or the Immigration Court. Connecting with qualified clinicians has never been easier thanks to the immigrationevaluationdirectory.com. Free to use, you can filter the directory by location, language, case type, and more, then review profiles and reach out. The Immigration Evaluation Directory is your one-stop resource to find the best therapist to help. Explore more today at immigrationevaluationdirectory.com and get the help that you need. So if you see the changes in State Department in the last 10 years, essentially it's been gutted. I mean, it's a shadow of itself with regard to funding. Maybe now it's gotten better, but even during Obama's time, they're cutting funding, cutting staff and stuff. And we're seeing it now when we deal with consular officers. It just a lot of posts don't have they have what is it called, like acting chief and all that kind of stuff. Have you seen maybe behind the scenes? Is it the State Department said they're rehiring, and by I think October of last month they were starting the rehiring and reopening process, bringing new people on board. Have you seen that behind the scenes with your connections that things are getting restaffed, or is it still starving for manpower or people power, personnel, and money? How does that look from your perspective?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, at the end of the day, the landscape has fundamentally changed. We were talking a little bit before we started recording here. I just recently worked with a national basketball team that was playing in the United States. They reached out in September. We're talking now in November 2022. They reached out in September for an appointment for B1, B2s to come to play in this tournament. It was a FIBA-sanctioned International Basketball Federation tournament. And the first available appointments were not until March of 2025. And so that comes at the end of a 12-month period in which the Department of State has adjudicated more visas than they did in 2019. And most people don't realize that. In terms of overall adjudications, the numbers are almost where they were pre-pandemic. The problem is the demand is so much higher and the backlog is so much higher. And so I think it's, there's more people from a financial perspective. There's more affluence, there's more of an interest globally in traveling to the United States. And so the demand remains high for B1, B2s. There's more job opportunities. And so there's more employment-based visa cases that did get held up during the pandemic. So the backlog there is more substantial. So I would say that's tourist visas. I don't think overall the number of specific work visas and Fs necessarily at the same number as 2019, but I just think the demand is so much higher. They have devoted more funding, they have made hiring, but just like we talked about, when I was hired into the Foreign Service, I was hired in June of 2009. I didn't get to Ecuador for my first post until April of 2010. So it just takes time to train them, to give them a language if they need be, to facilitate the move and everything that needs to takes place for a diplomat to move from the United States to another country. Because they don't just show up and are adjudicating 250 NIV cases a day, right? Because it's not just the immigration process that you have to understand in the computer systems. It's also the linguistic element, right? Because you're doing those interviews in another language more often than not. So getting that down, understanding what they're saying, and then understanding the culture of a country. So you start to understand, again, going back to Ecuador, travelers were often going, they would older applicants on paper were pretty bad applicants, right? Because they didn't really have a job. They were grandparents. They had family in the United States. But once you got to understand it, they didn't want to live in Queens. They'd go for 4 months, take care of their grandkids, spend some time there, and then they come back to Ecuador. So, it just takes some time to understand that, no, they're not going there to live. Everybody in front of you is not misrepresenting themselves and wants to live in the United States. Even if their economic situation is not one that you can necessarily relate to, it doesn't mean that, that they're lying.
Yeah, I was talking to a former consular officer a couple months back, and he said when I first got into the embassy, what I considered marriage fraud was the opposite. About 5 years later, I was thinking I was completely different analysis after 5 years. The things I would assume that I was fraud was no, it's just people's lives. It's not what you think about it. And then the indicators completely change from experience. And That takes time. All this takes time. There's though, unfortunately, for human beings all over the world, and particularly America, we have this thing like, okay, just stuff some officers there and it's going to turn. And it's like, no, I tell clients because they're frustrated too. I'm like, this is just a slow process. It's human beings. They got to know. It's better you get more training so you don't make mistakes on the line, if anything, because fixing our mistakes is going to be such a headache. But it's
well, and that's a great point, John, because it's not just throwing officers at the demand and chopping away. Because if you do that, then you end up with more people denied. Perhaps 214 they receive a 214B ruling, and therefore they just apply again. So then you're not really cutting into the demand. Maybe you clear off the initial case, but then it just comes back in another way, and it's more time, it's more work, and so you absolutely want to make sure those cases are adjudicated properly.
So that working with these leagues and stuff is very interesting. Obviously, you really know the NBA really well, but other leagues are coming in and learning about your services. How is the nature? How's the health of global sports now? COVID's done. Are these? I mean, we have the World Cup happening in Qatar, but how is the movement of global migration of sports and stuff? How active is it right now?
Very active. We're talking a day after the NFL had their first regular season game in Germany. More than 60,000 fans. They said they had over 100,000 demands for tickets. So just incredible interest in American sports. Whether you have the NBA that just played a couple of games in Japan and a couple of games in UAE. They're also going to Mexico and to France in this season for regular season games. Baseball is doing, they've been doing games in Europe. They're looking at doing more games in Asia in the future. And so all the American sports really are seeking to grow their global footprint. And just to round that out, you've got NHL, which already, roughly 28 to 30% of NHL players are American. The rest are either Canadian or other nationalities. And then you have MLS, which is really getting ready to have a moment. I think, there's increasingly attention around the professionalism of the league, how well it's run, the level of play. It's just growing and growing. And so each one of these leagues, although American-based, are seeking to grow their international footprint. And you look at the NBA, as I mentioned, some of the top players in the league are internationally born, whether it's Antetokounmpo from Greece via Nigeria, Joel Embiid from Cameroon, Luka Doncic from Slovenia, or Jokic from Serbia. I mean, they're really coming from all corners of the world, and that's only seeking to increase. Compounding that is the fact you mentioned the World Cup. It's in Qatar in 2022. The next World Cup in 2026 is in the United States. It's split between the US, Mexico, and Canada. Less than 24 months after that will be the Olympics, also in the United States. So in terms of the global sport landscape, the eyes of the world really will be on the United States for the next decade.
Good, and a lot of O1, EB1A visa opportunities for immigration lawyers. Now,
that's true. That's true.
One thing that pops up, obviously, the nature of sports, there is a percentage of them of athletes that drug abuse or criminal activities, and if they're in the United States, they'll deal with that. But U.S. requires waivers sometimes if they have criminal history. You mentioned Japan; they're really hardcore about immigration, especially about crime and stuff. How is the situation getting them there and waivers, or how tough is it? We have Brittany Renner right now stuck in Russia right now. How strict are they with regards to people like American athletes who may have conviction history getting visas to these countries? That's something that pops up they have to deal with, or in the sports nature, they're more forgiving or issue waivers easier? How does that all work out?
It definitely does pop up for sure. Mistakes are made. There's individuals who are in professional sports who have a criminal history. Canada, for example, all NBA teams have to travel to Canada at some point in the season to play the Toronto Raptors. And, they're really strict about alcohol-related offenses, for example. So if someone, player, coach, staffer has a DUI in the past, that can be a real issue. And so we'll work closely with both Canadian immigration officials and then U.S. Immigration officials at CBP coming back into the country. Canada is one you see a lot because there is obviously so much. It's kind of a special relationship there, and then just adjudicating as need be and facilitating the crossing over at the border. But like with Japan, other countries, what part of what I do, I'm based in Washington, D.C., and it puts me in a position where I can actually sit down with diplomats, and having worked in the Foreign Service, having lived abroad, it really helps break down some of those barriers. It builds that commonality. So prior to the NBA going to Japan, I went and spent a couple of days for meetings at the Japanese embassy, just explained what the NBA was doing, explained what the travel party would look like, and tried to work closely with them to facilitate, because every traveler at that point in time needed a visa. So it was more than 500 visas to get into the country.
And the Canadian issue, for example, with guard DUIs has been always a serious issue, because I can't count the number of times people are trying to go to Canada and then at the last second they didn't realize they're so strict about DUIs. They kind of streamlined the waiver process for the last year or two, but I know so many people are like, I was trying to go to Canada, they didn't let me go. What should I do? I'm like, well, that they're hardcore about having a DUI when they let you in. And then especially when you come, it's not just the players, their staff and stuff. How often does it pop up at the last second? You realize, oh, this person has that, and then I mean, that really destroy you. But keep staff member now, they come. How often does that happen, or are you able to work it out a lot of times? How does it, just from experience, what have you seen?
Yeah, I think, when I first started, we were really first building this out at the NBA. It would happen more frequently. Now there's just such an awareness around the league, and I've worked closely with all 30 teams to ensure that the travelers are in a position to be able to move back and forth as need be across the border without issue. That's not to say that it's never an issue, and there's a number of NBA players who are from a country that requires a visa to Canada. So we work to make sure that they have the Canadian visa in place so that they can travel into the country. A country like Turkey requires a visa into Canada, so we have to make sure that they have that in order prior to the season.
All the fans watching sports, they don't realize the last thing they'll think about is like, oh, getting this person a visa. They think about trainers and food and all this stuff, but they don't even think about this aspect of it. And for the immigration lawyers, like there's a ton of people on O1 stuff like that that you're dealing with. Do they have their own lawyers? Does the league provide lawyers? Or do they have agents? Or how could the immigration lawyers get in on this incoming ability clients? So what kind of representation do they generally get or request?
Yeah, well, there is a robust network of sports immigration lawyers out there, and I've been fortunate enough to get to know a number of them in that space and work closely with them. So what I always tell them is, what I'm doing with Jetr Global really augments their services. So again, in no way supplants what they're doing with their client. There's a role and a place for the attorney, but increasingly there's a role and a place for somebody who can help work behind the scenes to expedite appointments. And so to your question, on the NBA side, they don't oversee the visa process directly, in that there's not immigration attorneys on staff. Teams are free to work with individual law firms of their choosing, and all have some law firm, all of whom I work with from an NBA perspective. But now expanding out into other leagues, each league kind of does it differently. Some will do the petitions through the league office, and then where the O's and P's actually come through the league office and then are carried at the team level. Others do it at the team level, where the petitioner is the team entity itself. So it depends on the sports and kind of how the league has set that up.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's fascinating stuff. Really gives a behind the scenes perspective. If someone wanted to contact you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, so you mentioned the name jetrglobal.com. So my email address is just Travis at jetrglobal. Who might have an interest in discussing more how we maybe could work together.
Really quick, it like cut out. So restart from where you said your email address, because my internet paused all of a sudden. So then just edited it.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for that, John. So people can reach me at Travis at jetrglobal.com. JETR is Jetr Global. And my webpage is jetrglobal.com itself. So please reach out. If you have show notes, please feel free to put my phone number in there, my contact information, and happy to talk to anybody who might be interested in learning more, or just doing a quick chat about what the landscape looks like.
Wonderful. And how does your company look like? Staff, or is it primarily yourself and just with your connections and stuff, or how big has it gotten? I mean, it's a new company. You've been doing this work, but the actual independent Jetr Global is fairly new. How does it look like right now?
Yeah, 2 employees and myself. So it's been great. The demand has been far beyond. It's kind of a double-edged sword, right, John? On one hand, the business is doing great, and I really appreciate kind of the interest in sports entities and attorneys and others who have reached out to me. On the other side of that, it's because the system is so dysfunctional that the services are needed. But really, I think right now it's working to strengthen connections prioritize sports within the U.S. government, and then we can focus on bigger picture, advocacy, where there's some real fundamental policy issues that affect sports that we're working to get more involved in as well.
Thanks. It's a fascinating thing. It really is. Just to, take the politics out of it and just have people go play sports and stuff and do these leagues. And it really kind of, closes the barriers of people. So it's a wonderful place to be where you can wake up and like, I'm doing some good work, it's helping people in a different kind of way. So it's immigration really allows that for you to be able to like touch upon the global humanity in different ways, a very positive light. Is there anything else you want to leave us with or anything comment like that?
No, it's a great point, John. Sports really does set itself apart in the way that it brings people together, and not just fans watching a football game on a Sunday, but also you look at programs in the developing world that they're seeking to reach young people. I mean, it typically involves a basketball or a soccer ball, right, or some sort of ball to kind of bring people together, because it's this equalizer that breaks down barriers and gets kids playing together. And there's so many aspects that are so inherent in sports that are positive for health and wellness and just civic engagement. There's respect for diversity, teamwork, leadership, and there's all these aspects of sport that I think the U.S. government sees that it can use those tools, but that's what we're trying to help push that forward and really utilize sports diplomacy as a greater opportunity in the future.
Is you've seen so many former NBA players go to China and join Chinese leagues, and that it's a whole new aspect of diversity. Like they're not used to seeing a 7-foot black guy, but like they're there and they say, okay, like it's a different kind of thing for them to see and get used to. Which is good, and that person speaks English and American, and they get a different perspective of Americans rather than what the state-run television may tell them about what an American is. To see this person's nice person just playing basketball and stuff. So it is great. Even with Russia, one thing I learned about the whole Brittany Renee situation, I might say her last name wrong, is apparently WNBA is like a really big deal in Russia. And so it's like, oh, fascinating. Like different countries have things they like a lot. Russia apparently likes women's basketball a lot. That's like a big thing over there. So as you just learn about different cultures a lot that way. But thank you so much for coming on. See, I'm online real quick. I'll end the show, but thanks everyone for watching. Definitely reach out to Travis when you have these cases. And, I'm guessing it could be more than just sports. If someone has, a concert band they want to bring in or something, you kind of branch out, or are you kind of limited to just athletes for now?
I'm happy to have the conversation and see if it makes sense, if there's an angle. I'm certainly not necessarily looking just for any immigration case that comes, because it becomes more difficult to justify because there's so many priorities right now that the embassies are trying to deal with. But I think sports in particular is one where the previous two administrations, both the Biden administration and the Trump administration, declared that sports was in the national interest. Yeah. And so exemptions and waivers were put in place for pro sports. So it's just reaffirming that it remains in the national interest and should therefore be prioritized.
Thank you so much. Fascinating interview. I appreciate it. Keep in touch and let me know how things go, and hope listeners enjoy it.
Thanks, John. Appreciate the opportunity.